Torture, enforced disappearances, a lack of human rights. The story of Guantanamo Bay. More than 10 years ago, one man promised the detention center would close. So incoming US President Joe Biden is now under more pressure than ever to stick to his pledge. But will he? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Peter Dobbie. Now, it's been 19 years since the US opened the military detention centre at Guantanamo Bay. It quickly became notorious for human rights abuses and the fact the US administration didn't consider its detainees were entitled to any protection from international laws. Now, Amnesty International is urging the incoming US President, Joe Biden, to fulfil a promise he made a decade ago to close it down. There are still 40 people being held there with no access to a fair trial. Amnesty's 62-page report says the detentions at Guantanamo are inescapably bound up with years of unlawful government misconduct and that there's a continuing lack of accountability for that. It provides details of the secret transfers, interrogations, forced feeding of hunger strikers, torture, enforced disappearances, and a complete lack of due process for the prisoners there. Amnesty says when Biden was vice president under Barack Obama, the administration did vow to close the facility but failed to do so during 8 years in office. Let's take a closer look now at how it all started at Guantanamo and where things are now as of today. Well, the US sent the first 20 detainees there after the events of 9/11, the attacks in 2001, as part of what the then Bush administration called its war on terror. They weren't considered criminals or prisoners of war and so were not subject to international human rights law. In 2006, top al-Qaeda members arrived, including the architect of those attacks on America, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. They were interrogated using techniques such as waterboarding, which is widely condemned as torture. 3 years later, in 2009, President Barack Obama took office, vowing to close the facility within 1 year. Fast forward to 2013, it was still open. Dozens of inmates went on a hunger strike in protest. Mr. Obama ended his 2 terms in office, describing Guantanamo as a facility that should have never been opened in the first place. His successor, Donald Trump, said the people there were terrorists and ordered that it should be kept open. OK, for more on this, joining us on the programme today in Washington, D.C., we have Alka Pradhan, Human Rights Counsel at the Guantanamo Bay Military Commissions. She also conducted an investigation into the CIA's Extraordinary Rendition Programme. From London, we have Simon Crowther. He's a legal advisor for Amnesty International. He commissioned the report we're talking about. And in New York, we have Karen Greenberg, Director of the Center on National Security at Fordham University School of Law. Karen also wrote The Least Worst Place, Guantanamo's First 100 Days. Welcome to you all. Alka in Washington, coming to you first. Do you think Joe Biden will shut it down?
That is certainly the hope, and hope springs eternal. I think that President Biden, even without Congress, had a good roadmap for how to go about doing this. We have detainee counsel in association with a number of NGOs here on the ground, including Amnesty International, have come up with a series of recommendations for how he can do so, including reopening or recreating the State Department's position for the closure of Guantanamo and starting to negotiate and actually transfer men out who have all been cleared for years. So I think that he has a good roadmap for doing so. And certainly now that he has Congress, his options are wider.
Karen Greenberg in New York. Joe Biden said 10, 11 years ago, we will close it down. Barack Obama said he would shut it down within the first 2 years of his first term. It's still there. What's gone wrong?
Well, actually, President Obama said he would close it within 1 year. And what went wrong was he didn't anticipate the political backlash that he would have by delaying the decisions about how to actually close it down. And so now President Biden, will have learned from this, we hope, and can begin to do this quickly and efficiently. And just one tag on to what was just said, I think the special envoy for closing Guantanamo office does need to be reopened immediately, but it needs to be staffed in a much more robust way. It's complicated. Negotiations that need to go on, and that's a first and important step.
Simon Crowther in London. You commissioned this report, Simon. It's not the first report of its kind that we've had in the past 15, 16 years or so. Do you get, as a pushback, anything more than just platitudes when politicians, perhaps presidents or prime ministers in the countries where people have been taken to from Guantanamo, do you get anything more than platitudes from them?
We're calling for the closure of Guantanamo Bay because it is such a significant and ongoing human rights violation. Those who are currently detained there have been subjected to torture, they've been subjected to enforced disappearance, and none have been brought fairly to trial. In terms of the reactions that we receive when Amnesty International is not involved in arranging for the transfers of detainees out of Guantanamo, but our understanding is that there are some states that are willing to take those who are detained there, perhaps not all of them at the moment, but we're optimistic, as already said by Alka, that hopefully Joe Biden will be able to bring this issue forward and to arrange for the transfer of all those within Guantanamo Bay out of the detention base. Now, we make two calls there. One call, as already said, is for all those to be transferred out. And the second call is where there is sufficient evidence and sufficient admissible evidence, that is evidence that hasn't been gained through torture, then, and only if such evidence exists, some may then face fair trial in federal court. But as I stress, only if such admissible evidence exists. And we are, I have to say at this stage, doubtful that it does.
Alka in Washington. Why did the flow of people being transferred out of Guantanamo sort of stumble to being at a standstill? Was that a deliberate decision on the part of somebody at the base, or was it a decision perhaps taken in Washington?
Well, you know, even during the Obama administration, there were massive frustrations at the pace of which men were being cleared for release and then transferred, primarily because Obama gave free rein to the Justice Department and the Department of Defense to contest the habeas applications of those men who could be transferred. And so what you saw is at the end of the Obama administration, there's this rush, realizing that Trump is going to come in and probably stop the transfers. There's this rush to transfer as many people as you can towards the end of 2016. But unfortunately, they couldn't get as many out as they would have liked. And so you had men who were cleared for release under Obama, basically facing at least another 4 years of being there. Now, during the Trump administration, as promised, really no one's being transferred except for one individual whose transfer was negotiated prior with Saudi Arabia, who, of course, is an ally of the United States and particularly of the Trump administration. But that had been negotiated prior to Trump coming into office. You saw no other transfers during the Trump administration, and that was by design. I mean, no one in this administration was interested in certainly human rights issues at Guantanamo, but they weren't interested in putting the resources in to negotiate those transfers. And of course, they have a fundamental misunderstanding of what national security means in this administration. And so yes, of course, it slowed it didn't slow, it stopped completely. And we're hoping that that'll now restart. If I may just briefly add on to something that Simon just said regarding the possibility of fair trials, I represent one of the defendants in the 9/11 case. And I can tell you the government has admitted that their primary evidence in this case are statements made by these men in 2007 after they were brought to Guantanamo. And we are in the middle of suppression hearings on that evidence to suppress that evidence. And what we have so far from witnesses is that basically shows that evidence is entirely the product of torture.
Would it be fair to say, Karen, I mean, the people who criticize Guantanamo Bay, they basically say it is, in effect, a concentration camp. It is the application of legal and physical power applied to a place that has kind of outgrown its original purpose. And that's highlighted surely by the fact that we've now got these tribunals taking place in Guantanamo, which couldn't arguably take place any place else, because if they took place someplace else, they'd have to be legally constituted in a completely different way.
Right. So those are two different things. I mean, I think that, Guantanamo was a problem outside the law from the very day it opened. So I wouldn't say that it's outgrown its purpose. Its purpose was always contrary to United States military and international law. And, originally they said it was for military commissions. That really hasn't happened in any fair or even productive way since the very beginning. So that's one thing. I think the question of these trials and what would happen with them, could they be returned, as Eric Holder had wanted, Attorney General Eric Holder under Obama had wanted, to federal court, is not, I don't think it's as complicated, but I would defer to Alka on this, as everybody says. But I think there are some issues that are on the table. One is the death penalty. Is there a possibility the death penalty could be taken off the table in preparation for some kind of plea deals? We have the United States federal courts, civilian courts, have tried one detainee from Guantanamo, Ahmed Gailani, for the lethal bombings in Tanzania and Kenya. And torture was involved in all methods of that case, both in terms of evidence that the prosecution wanted to bring and couldn't bring, and in terms of the individual on trial himself. So there is some precedent for being able to have these trials. There's no guarantee how they would turn out, nor should there be. And so this would be a viable solution going forward. But remember, we can't do these trials in the United States as currently decreed by law, because no detainee can be brought to the United States for any reason whatsoever.
Okay.
So that's the quagmire.
Okay, Simon in London, is there any evidence at all over the past 15 years plus that these enhanced techniques have stopped or foiled a potential attack on America, the United States, or American interests around the world?
Absolutely none whatsoever. In fact, there's clear evidence that it hasn't worked. The US Senate, in fact, investigated the Senate inquiry investigated the program of what was called enhanced interrogations and CIA black sites. And what they found was that there was no actionable intelligence from that policy. What torture does is really stains a country's human rights record in a manner that is very difficult to comprehend. And when it is the US doing that, it sets a horrendous precedent for the rest of the world that torture will be tolerated. And what is really very shocking is here we are, nearly 19 years on, going into the 20th year, with no accountability whatsoever for that program of torture instigated by the US.
Alka, at a moral level, can incoming President Joe Biden, who's made from the same political putty as Barack Obama, if you will, can he go further than just closing Guantanamo? Can he wipe the slate clean, or is that utterly impossible?
It is utterly impossible. That said, I think that there are a number of things that Biden can do that will speak to what Simon was just talking about the complete lack of accountability for the torture program. At the moment, right, that lack of accountability has led to a number of people involved in the torture program being promoted, given a platform to issue this sort of disinformation about the torture program, to the point where here we are in 2021 talking about a program that existed largely between 2002 and 2007, wondering whether or not the torture technique was work. And of course they did. They didn't. And we know that. We have we have plenty of evidence to show that it didn't work. The Senate report is one repository of that evidence. And so, what he can do is educate people. He can educate people with regards to Guantanamo on the number of mistakes that were made in bringing men to Guantanamo there in the first place, the bounties that we paid for some of those men, the misinformation that led to some of those men being there. But with regards to the CIA program and the use of torture, both in the CIA program and at Guantanamo, Biden can go a long way towards saying, look, yes, we just had a CIA director who was involved in the torture program. And I know everyone talks about her qualifications, but that doesn't mean that doesn't in any way validate what happened under this torture program. Here
Understood.
are the real effects of what happened.
Okay, just let me knock on with those 2 points that you've raised there, Alka, to back to Karen Greenberg in New York. Karen, on that idea of the CIA and educating people, clearly the chain of accountability is broken, was broken. I remember Gina Haspel two and a bit years ago when she was at her CIA hearing. And she said, and I remember the quote very distinctly, she said something like, I have a strong moral compass. And she was using her morality to defend a situation that all three of you, I guess, would say is completely immoral and was immoral from the decision-making process up to and including where we are today. So how do you re-educate those people in the CIA, those people that say, yes, extraordinary rendition is fine, let's charter a plane and let's fly somebody from Guantanamo to a black location someplace in the world that doesn't officially exist?
Yeah, to Alka's point, the lack of accountability was horrendous in the past. And I would say more than educate people, there's still a chance to hold people accountable. And you probably saw this morning that President-elect Biden has said he's going to nominate William Burns, a longtime State Department diplomat, to head the CIA, which is a signal that nobody who was a part of this from the CIA and the CIA years when the torture program was in effect is going to run the CIA. It's an important message, but it's not enough. So, you know, that's a beginning.
Simon, is Guantanamo and its continued existence totemic of an awful lot that's wrong with that mindset that Karen is trying to break down there, in as much as when Pompeo ran the CIA and McMaster became Trump's national security advisor, both of them signaled very clearly it is wrong in principle to have Guantanamo and it's wrong in practice to have Guantanamo. But those guys, you know, they are not bleeding heart liberals. Those two do not pick up The Guardian and agree with everything they see in the editorial page of The Guardian or the Wall Street Journal. I suggest that they would never do that, ever, anyway. And they were signalling to Mr. Trump. Mr. Trump in 2018 said, no, we've got it, we keep it, we may carry on using it.
Do you know, I don't think it matters whether you're a liberal or a conservative. Torture is just plain wrong, and so is indefinite detention. What we see in Guantanamo is people who've been subject to enforced disappearance. That means that they've been picked up without any due process. They've been disappeared for years in many instances. Their existence, of course, is now acknowledged, and we know where they are, and as do their family. But many have not had access or adequate access to a lawyer. And so, yeah, I would stress that this cannot be a Republican, liberal, conservative, Democrat issue. This is an issue of human decency and human dignity and human rights. Can I also just pick up one of the points that's already been made, or in fact two? Yes, there needs to be accountability and there needs to be re-education. I completely agree with all that's just been said on both those points. But there's an additional step that's really very important, and that is that the US ratifies the international human rights treaties that would mean that this can never, ever happen again. What the US tried to do in the case of Guantanamo is create a system outside of international human rights law. It tried to push aside human rights law, the Geneva Conventions, the international human rights treaties, and to perpetrate the horrendous crimes that we have discussed in forced disappearance and torture. What needs to happen is a more robust legal framework within the US, signing on to the treaties created already by the international community to make sure that that never can happen ever again. And that is something that Biden could achieve, and I think would leave a really very significant long-term legacy to his administration. And finally, on the point that you raise, can the slate ever be wiped clean? I completely agree. The answer is no. The report that Amnesty launches today is called Right the Wrong, though, because we think that there are steps that can be taken to at least go some way into improving the situation and mitigating against this disaster that has been Guantanamo Bay.
Alka, you were nodding your head in agreement there. One point to you, though. Is the existence of Guantanamo Bay and what America does with it now almost part of like an existential crisis that's going on in America that's been kind of fueled and brought together or brought into focus by the outgoing President Trump? Because there are aspects to America, racism, inequality, that predate him, but will still be there once he's gone. The Proud Boys aren't really going away. And that's something that America has to get to grips with as a broader concept, because, you know, there are lots of people that say Guantanamo Bay starts with and ends with racism, because America just doesn't like brown people.
Yes, and I'm one of those people who says that on a constant basis. Guantanamo Bay would not exist if we were talking about white men from France or Germany. It's because they are brown men that we as a country decided that it was okay to hold them outside of U.S. law, outside of what we consider to be U.S. territory, certainly for the Justice Department's purposes, and not apply our regular laws to them and establish a new tribunal for them, which is illegal under international law. And, you know, I think that if you look at Guantanamo Bay, our comfort, our grotesque comfort with holding these men indefinitely, these, you know, to many Americans, nameless, faceless brown men in a camp, is what led us to being relatively comfortable after 4 years now of living with brown children and women and children and families on the border. I mean, I think that you can draw a direct line from one to the other. The lack of accountability for Guantanamo and the torture there and the CIA torture has led to greater and greater crimes by government officials who now know that they can get away with almost anything. I mean, I think, you know, what started at Guantanamo, what started with the sort of initial steps taken after on the so-called war on terror that violated international law, has turned into a sort of so-called national security Frankenstein monster.
OK, Karen, if Joe Biden says maybe day one, day two in the Oval Office, if he says, fine, we're closing it in 2 years' time, but if closing it just means sending people to other locations, that's a conjuring trick. That's a presidential conjuring trick. What's the point?
Yeah, well, to start with, it would be okay to whatever reason he can find to get people out of Guantanamo is terrific. But to your question, absolutely, it needs to be closed down, and it needs to be done with a lot of declarations about what this means and how wrong it was. I want to just tag on to something Alka said that's actually very important. It wasn't just what happened at Guantanamo. It was what we feared from the beginning. And it wasn't just in violation of international humanitarian law. It was about, or human rights law, it was about what could happen to the rule of law in the United States and elsewhere. Because once you compromised and corrupted the standards because of torture and other, aberrations, you could do it anywhere. And
okay.
it led to the board and to the court system. OK,
Karen, thank you for that. Simon, last word or two to you. You commissioned the report. Barack Obama, February 2016, when he was talking about trying to close it, said, this is about closing a chapter in American history. That chapter is clearly still being dictated by somebody. It's still being written by somebody. And if it's not closed down, does Guantanamo Bay therefore carry on serving as a recruiting tool for the kind of people who want to do bad things to America?
We simply don't know, and there's a myriad of reasons why people join armed groups. But what we can say for sure is that it will continue to be a stain on international human rights law and a stain on the US's human rights record while it remains open. It really needs to be closed as a matter of absolute urgency. And it is a clear thorn in the side of any kind of US legitimacy when it professes to tell other countries about their own human rights records.
OK, we must leave it there. Thank you all so much for joining us here on Inside Story. Thank you to our guests. They were Alka Pradhan, Simon Crowther and Karen Greenberg. And thank you, too, for your company. You can see the programme again anytime via our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Peter Dobbie, and the entire team here in Doha, thanks for watching. We will see you tomorrow at the usual times. Until then, bye-bye.